The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. This is Gary from Vigilant Software. Thank you very much for your attendance this morning. The purpose for today's webinar is for existing clients and also newcomers to CyberComply to either refresh your memory on how the system works, why data protection by design and by default is key to achieving compliance success, and ultimately to show off some of the latest features and how to use the system in its entirety. As we go through, please feel free to ask any questions. We do have it open on a separate screen, so we will do our best to answer them as we're going through. If there's anything that we can't answer that will need to be addressed after the meeting, we'll come back to you on a one-to-one basis and cover off any sort of concerns you might have. So without further ado, we'll get started. The screen that you should be able to see should be our opening presentation. So it should be the data protection by design and by default, presented by myself at Vigilant Software. What we're going to do is just ultimately explain the different elements, who the platform is ultimately aimed at and who will be using it, and obviously how we're going to use it in its best case scenario. So today's discussion, as I've just touched on, is going to be an introduction to what is CyberComply, who is it ultimately aimed at, and Q&As. There'll also be elements of jumping into the platform itself to obviously show off some of the latest features and how we're actually going to use them as well. So what is CyberComply? CyberComply is a platform that we've created here at Vigilant Software, which helps organizations all the way from micro level to entry level into enterprise as well. The purpose of it is to bring more of a collaborative, uniformed way of dealing with compliance and risk across a business. As we know, some of the struggles that you may face is going to be surrounding documents, policies, Excel spreadsheets, and it's very hard to keep track of them when they're dotted around the space, both on things like SharePoint, if they're stored on local drives, etc. The other options or the other points to CyberComply is to reduce the variability by helping you make consistent decisions, again, touched on that uniformed way of tackling compliance. It's also built to be maintainable for and by multiple stakeholders across your organization. So we'll go into a bit more detail as to how you can set up organization admins all the way down to read-onlys, so they can see how the project is evolving and where they sit within it, but more importantly, so that they can't obviously mess around too much with the project itself. We've also built it so that in our eyes, we've made it as cost effective as possible, so that if you're a micro organization, we offer monthly billing. We also offer mix and match. So if you want to start one project, let's say for GDPR risk management, just general privacy risk, etc., you can start that project and then later on bolt on the other elements. We do offer discounts, as you probably may well know, that the more you purchase, the more you save, and over a longer period of time, again, it will bring in that cost effectiveness as well. So how CyberComply is built is CyberComply is ultimately the platform that all of these offerings sit on. You can, if you go onto Vigilant website or our partner IT Governance's site, you will see that CyberComply can be purchased as a complete suite, which will incorporate all of these, as well as some of the shared areas of the platform as well, which obviously I'll hopefully demonstrate as we go through. Just to touch on each one of these, we have VS Risk Cloud. This is to help organizations manage risk in to achieve certification for things like ISO 27001 certification. As we go across the screen, we have our GDPR manager. This was ultimately built for organizations to track breaches, track third parties, DSAR requests, and other elements, as well as a touch on to gap analysis as well. We then have our compliance manager, which is something that we rarely see sold by itself, as it's there to enhance or improve the visibility over certain controls, certain regulations, and again, we'll go over that in more detail. We then have the data flow mapping tool, which is to satisfy the Article 30 element of GDPR in order to show how records of data are being processed through the organization. And then a nice bolt-on that we tend to see sold directly in with this one is going to be the DPIA tool, as it's the natural follow-on stage of once you've identified your process, a data protection impact assessment is likely shortly to follow as well. So just to go through these in a bit more detail, VS Risk is an information security risk assessment tool created by ISO 27001 experts. So we pull a lot of our resource from our parent company, IT Governance, as they have a number of subject matter experts, both in the fields of ISO 27001 and other standards, as well as we also have a dedicated team for the law aspect, as well as GDPR as well. We are shortly going to be introducing a document storage option, which will allow organizations to store any type of document, whether it's a work procedure, whether it's a policy, etc. They can be linked to support risks, controls, maybe process maps, etc. And part of VS Risk Cloud and its main selling point is the fact that it can automatically run both the risk treatment plan and your statement of applicability without any further manipulation needed over the assessment itself. Moving on, we touch on to the Compliance Manager, and it's essentially designed to help users meet their legal and regulatory requirements. We see it as more of a checklist, so it's a way for an organisation that need it as a referencing tool, maybe a library that they can refer back to at any given point. And there's areas where you can mark just general compliance or implementation of certain control sets. Touching on that, the controls and regulations that we have included are the recently updated Cyber Essentials Framework 3.3, CSA version 3 at 27001, NIST for more of our American organizations that use this as a framework, as well as PCI elements as well for organizations that are dealing with credit card transactions or payments as well. We also have included the entirety of the EU GDPR, as well as the DPA 2018 and UK laws, and it also gives the option and the ability for an organisation to upload their own controls and regulations. A prime example that we've experienced of this recently is we've been working with a large motor group. They in-house have their own regulations, their own compliancy projects, so they need to be able to have them easily accessible within this platform to again link directly to policies, documents, process maps, DPIAs, etc. Moving on, we then come on to the data flow mapping tool. And the reason why we created this was again to help businesses understand how their information is being processed within the organization, what parts of the business it's going to be handled by, how long it's looked after for. You can illustrate quite clearly retention periods. We offer clear and detailed reports of the processing, and it'll also flag any risks that might be pertaining to transfers outside of the EEA or to third countries as well. The DPIA tool, as I've mentioned previously, it is a very common bolt-on that we see along with the data flow mapping tool, and the purpose of this is to help organizations determine whether a DPIA needs to even be conducted in the first place, and it does this by asking the user to answer 2 sections out of 6 to very quickly identify, does a DPIA need to even be completed for this process. So it's an amazing way of stopping organizations, or not necessarily stopping, preventing organizations from conducting unnecessary assessments when they don't actually need to be completed in the first place. We have built-in risk measurements available to you, and these can also be linked directly back to maybe an ISO 27001 risk assessment as well, so you can use the same impact and likelihood scales and share the outcome between them. The last tab that we're going to view is the GDPR Manager, and it's ultimately designed for DPOs, data protection managers. GDPR Manager essentially comprises of 4 compliance modules. So the first screen we saw with the 5 offerings, GDPR Manager is the only one that then has a further 4 elements that are going to build out that entire offering. So one of them is going to be a gap analysis tool. Not all organizations have the ability, resource, finance available to them to bring in consultants, for example, but they might have somebody in-house that just simply needs a tool to use it as a checklist to help them understand where they might need to focus more of their time on, understand where their gaps are in the business, and obviously help plug those gaps. It also has an area that you can report data breaches. We've had a conversation with the housing association this morning, where they have been using it to not only show any current data breaches, but also to keep track of any historic ones. So should they be asked, they can show continual improvement over time. There's also an element for DSARs. So again, that aforementioned housing association, we're using it to show previous DSARs, but it takes the user through a very structured way of illustrating that they've essentially ticked all the boxes in line with the requirements. So it will reference certain articles that it's going to be satisfied by answering the question. And it's just a nice way of keeping an audit log of how often you're being or how often you're receiving these DSARs. A very poignant point that I can put across here is that if you are receiving multiple requests from the same person over a short period of time, using our platform can quickly help you identify and illustrate to the ICO or whoever the governing body is that, look, we've offered as much information as we possibly can. Here's our history of that. Here's what we've done previously. We can't offer any more. This is now becoming a hindrance, and this is why we believe we shouldn't have to fulfill this DSAR. So that's one use case for the DSAR tracker. The last section is going to be keeping track of your third parties handling your data. That part of the tool is very straightforward. It's just going to keep track of who those organizations are, what they are seen as, whether they are a controller or processor of the data. And we also have some built-in questionnaires that you can share with those third parties. They complete, send back, and then you can store set deadlines and tasks to obviously reminder if the contract's coming up, for example. So, who is CyberComply ultimately aimed at? Now, I've mentioned that we try and offer this across multiple different sizes of business, from micro all the way up to entry-level enterprise. So the typical target audiences that we see taken on CyberComply or certain elements of it are information security officers or managers, risk managers, DPOs. We have lead implementers using it, security consultants, ISMS coordinators, and more often than not, when we're looking at ISO 27001, that job tends to be handed over to head of IT or IT management or equivalent levels. Now, this isn't a definitive list of the only people that can use it. CyberComply has also been used by very high levels, so CEOs if we're looking at smaller businesses, or it could be handled by a larger team of information security officers with varying types of job titles that go along with that as well. So now that we've had a brief introduction to CyberComply itself, what we're now going to do is go into the platform itself and show you some of the organization admin areas, as well as obviously the certain elements itself. So we're just going to bring this up into view now, make this full screen. So once a user has received their invitation and they're able to log in, they'll then be greeted by a dashboard. Now, for any new users that are taking on the CyberComply product from scratch, it will be a blank canvas. So don't expect when you first log in it will look similar to mine. Mine's a demonstration portal, so it has some basic elements already completed within it. What the dashboard is built for is to give the user that's logging in to have a quick overview to maybe say, okay, well, we're going to focus on this area and we can just see it from here. But it's also used as quite a handy presentation tool. So if you need to show this to executives or anybody that's on the board that isn't necessarily involved in the project, but obviously they have the buy-in, so they need to see how it's progressing, the dashboard is ultimately going to be able to display that for them, so they can see how gap analysis projects are coming on, they can see where the majority of their data is being processed, we can see some of the latest tasks that are either overdue, completed, or what we've been working on. And nearer to the top, we can see organization risk, privacy risks, and also we can jump into some of the asset menus as well. So from an organization admin perspective, the main area that you're predominantly going to be focusing on before you even get started is either enlisting some of the other users onto the platform. You can modify their access level. We can change subscription options in here as well. You can modify your own user details. You can request assistance from our support team. And more importantly, there's settings menus, which allows you to create more of a unique experience for yourself. So how CyberComply is best going to benefit you, both with wording, terminology, what options are going to be available to you. So we're going to start off within the settings menu, and I'll start referring back to these when we get to them as we go through the actual tool itself. So settings is enlisted only to the organization admins, and within here you'll have helpful slightly tinged boxes here which will just explain what this area is actually trying to complete. The first one is going to be classifications. Now, classifications is used across multiple areas within CyberComply. It's used as a way of classifying the type of asset, the type of record, the use of certain asset classes, etc. So the ones that we offer to begin with would be your standard confidential, private, public, and restricted. However, we've then added on some additional ones, custom, that we've put in, such as sensitive or highly restrictive. Moving through, we then come into custom regions. A prime example of this might be that your organization is, let's say, in the same country, maybe in the same business park. However, you might want to illustrate the differences between the buildings or offices or locations. So you might have one organization that's right in the center of London, for example, so it's going to be subject to different risks, threats, etc., compared to one that you might have in the countryside, but it might be more susceptible to flooding, maybe electricity outages, etc. So that's something else that you can address on here. The next option down will then be your contact details. Now, this is something that I would encourage users to do right at the very beginning, because what this actually fills out is then going to be any reports that you're going to be running when you're looking at data protection impact assessments, as well as data flow maps as well. It helps satisfy that first section on both of those reports. It will just ask some basic information for your organization's location, your DPO's information, and then any representative that you might have as well. The next tab down is going to be for personal data items. A lot of our system does come preloaded with a lot of either preloaded personal data items, threats, or vulnerabilities, but we know full well that some businesses might take something outside those listings. So this is where you'll be able to add those on and then utilize them across the rest of the platform. That will also go for data subjects. So data subjects represent the categories of a natural person of which your organization processes data. So in here, typically when we're looking at process mapping, and we'll show you this later, you can simply say that it's a data subject and go no more detail on there. However, you can add some more details. So we've just outlined that they could be potential customers, UK potential customers, or just as a filler example, just data subject 2 if you define them separately that way around. The next option is data sources. So whilst you might most of the time be taking information from a natural person, it can at times often come from in our case, a data broker, maybe not the best wording, but it could be that you're obtaining leads if you're a sales organization from a marketing organization. So it could be that you're obtaining that source of data from there. The last 2 tabs on here will then be for custom threats and vulnerabilities, and this is where you can tailor what your DPIA and what your ISO 27001 risk assessments look like. We do offer lists of around 150 of each, ranging from bomb blast to inadequate firewalls, but if there's still not something in there that's specific to you, you can always customize it in these menus. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through CyberComply now. Just to illustrate that the dashboard is customizable, you can move stuff around if you need to. The way that you navigate through CyberComply is using the very top drop-down area. This will help you navigate to things like your asset libraries, your ISMS controls, legal requirements, processes, risk assessments, tasks, which include things like your DSARs, and then lastly, your gap analysis. One area that we're going to touch on to begin with is your assets, because this is a key point when you're looking at data processing, risk management, DPIAs, third-party tracking, etc. This is all going to pull information from here. So if you recall earlier, I mentioned that there are certain elements of CyberComply that are part of the fulfillment process, regardless of which module that you purchase. Assets is one of them. So if we look at assets from an individual standpoint, we can clearly see just a standardized list down here on the left-hand side. Now, this is a list that I've personally created. For new users, you can either create them on a one-by-one basis, so we can enter asset types, we can choose categories that they fall within, so hardware, software, people. We can give them their reference, so what is it named as within our business, who operates it, is it seen as a controller, is it operated by the business, who owns it. It's a free text box, so it can be heads of departments, it could be individual persons if you want to be that specific. Your locations, including the custom regions that you'd have entered in as well. The classification, so this is something that you could modify inside your settings menus. If you want it to belong to an asset class that you've created, you can assign it at this stage, and then lastly a description as well. Ultimately, what you end up with is, if we look at our advisor mobile device here, for example, and expand, we have all of that information clearly shown at a very top level. Now, what's quite handy about our asset library is that regardless of what part of the system you're utilizing, you can quickly jump to it from the asset perspective if you want to. Using these drop-down tabs, you can jump to what controls might be related to it. If there's any legal requirements that are related to the asset, we can see if there's any contracts in place as to why the asset has been identified. Has there been any tasks associated to this? Is it being used in any of our process maps? Are there any notes, messages, or uploads of documents, as well as an audit log of what modifications have taken place, who made them, and when? We can show relationships to other assets within our library. We can see if there's any records of data that are being stored on this particular asset. And then from a risk perspective, we can see how many risks are associated to this particular asset as well. To clarify one thing as well that we've been asked a few times, an asset isn't necessarily a specific item. It doesn't always need to be a laptop. It doesn't need to be a computer, server, etc. An asset is ultimately something that has value to the business, whether it's a data set, whether it's people, whether it's a process, for example. They can all be identified as an asset in this way. If we go back to the asset menu, we then have classes of assets, and this is quite handy for businesses where you might have, let's say, 1,000 laptops that belong to all of your staff members. It's going to be very long, laborious task to go through and manually risk assess every single one or show every single one of those inside a process map. The easiest way to do that is just to say, okay, mobile devices. This will include all devices that can be taken outside of the office, including but not limited to laptops, mobile phones, hard drives, etc. We can see that we have a number of assets that belong inside this group. So we have our CEO's laptop, we've got backups and marketing CRMs are there for examples. And from here, we can also see what risks are related to the overall group. Another thing within assets is going to be records of data. So inside records, this is something that will either pull from existing process maps you've created, or if you know what information you're taking before you start showing your processes, you can create them here and then utilize these as we go into the process maps themselves. So if we just create one for today, and we'll just give it a test naming convention, say it's confidential, the format's going to be in text, the recipients are going to be managers, as example, and the retention period to this, we're going to say that yes, we know we actually retain this information for a 7-year period. The description is going to be, this is a test, but the description could simply be that the information taken here is in order to fulfill a particular sales process or whatever you need it to be. We can then choose from our data subjects. We're going to say this information is coming from applicants. The personal data we're taking, we're just going to say a couple of the initials at the top here. Don't pay too much attention to what I'm actually choosing. Any sensitive data items we're taking, so we could just say that yes, we take physical health. The lawful basis for this is going to be consent, and the exception for taking the sensitive data, it could be for employment law, for example. Once you then create that record, we can then very clearly see that we can assign tasks, we can link it to specific process maps, we can see again if there's any notes or history that belongs to it, and we can also associate it to other related assets as well that might be using in process maps. So once we've finished off inside the asset menu, we can then move on into contractual. Now, contractual is an area where an example that we tend to use is if you're looking to satisfy a certain control within ISO 27001, you might be employing a third-party LMS provider for e-learning or staff awareness, and you can just keep a track of that contract. Maybe it's a yearly renewal product that you've purchased. Here you can simply say that the policy controls Vigilant Software internal, and it's going to be policies to support controls used when mitigating risks. And the actual contract in here that we're going to keep is saying training courses for all new employees. We can link it back to maybe a source documentation, maybe it's the contract itself, maybe it's stored on SharePoint. We can link that directly here as well. We then have how we're going to implement it, its status, and how it's when it's effective from and to. We can then see where that contract is going to be used. So it's used on 7.2.2 of ISO 27001. It's going to be linked to specific articles within the GDPR. We can show if there's any tasks that have been assigned. We can see if it's being linked to any process maps that we've created, any notes that we might have created, including documentation, assets that it might be joined to, any records, and again, any risks as well. So these drop-down tabs really do bring in the full picture of your compliance project in its entirety. From there, we then go into our control management. Now, the controls in here, we have Cyber Essentials, CSA, 27001, NIST, etc. The example that we tend to focus on is 27001. It's the more broadly used control framework. And within ISMS controls, you'll be able to access all of the individual controls from the annex. So if we look at 7.2.2 and expand, we can see what the requirement of that control is. We can also see, again, all of those drop downs. Now, a value add that we've put into the platform itself, again, pulling on resources from our partners and parent group, IT governance and GRCI law, we've been able to show the relationship between certain controls and certain legal requirements as well. So GDPR and 27001 go very nicely together, and this is how it's going to illustrate that for you. We can also see that that contract is related to here, as we saw a second ago looking at contracts, any tasks, excuse me, processes, notes, assets, etc., all that we've seen before. More importantly, if you are using it for an assessment tool, we can also see how many risks across the organization use this control as a mitigation step as well. The last areas that we can see when we're looking at controls, we can see what implementation status they have. Are they planned? Are they excluded, not applicable to the business, or a standard they'll be shown as not considered until you make that decision. The last tab on here is then going to be you as an organization picking your reason for choosing that control. Naturally, most of the time it's going to be part of your risk assessment, but it could also be due to statutory, regulatory, contractual, or business requirements as well. Below there, we then have justification, so why we're using the control, and it's training required to help control the theft and loss of IT equipment when traveling for work, as well as an implementation summary as to how we as a business are going to be putting this into practice as well. Once we've done this for each and every one of the controls, one of the elements that we touched on earlier is that you can run your your statements of applicability directly from within the system itself. You do so by selecting this icon at the top here. It takes a matter of seconds to complete itself, and automatically in here you'll be able to see what control set you're looking at, what the report is illustrating, the organization it belongs to, the issue date, as well as its version number as well for you to be certified against. If we scroll down to our 7.2.2, we've got that key information here, so it's not overcomplicating the statement of applicability. You're not needing to manipulate different Excel spreadsheets. It's all automatically here for you. If we scroll down further, the SOA will also include other control sets that we might be utilizing, such as PCI DSS version 3 and 3.2. From here, they can be printed or exported, ready for auditing or just for record keeping as well. Once we move on from controls, we then have the legal requirements. The one we're going to focus on predominantly is going to be the EU GDPR. And once we come into here, they're broken down into their individual chapters. So if we look at chapter 1, general provisions, and expand on each one of these and bring them all into the main view over here, we can drop down on each one. It will give you the requirement, source documentation to the actual article itself. And again, we've got all of those drop down tabs being utilized again for you. Something that we've done is we've then shown relationships between the recitals and the articles that we're looking at, so subject matter and objectives. We can see that the related legal requirements is recital 1, 2, 3, 4, the majority of them really at this point. We can then mark you're compliant, so whether you're compliant, non-compliant, not considered, or it's excluded, not applicable to the business. If we scroll down to Article 2, material scope, and expand, again, we have that requirement, source documentation, implementation guidance that we can offer, but more importantly, it's now showing the mirror side of the controls, showing relationships to the regulation. We're now looking at the regulation back onto the controls. So 5.1.1 is closely related to Article 2 material scope. From here, you can run a number of reports. We have drop-down pie charts to give you a quick overview of how much of it are you complying with, non-compliant, or not considering at this time. And we can also run reports on each one of these sections directly from within here. We can see the key information. It just summarizes each one of those drop-downs to show if there's any associated controls, tasks, assets, or risks. Moving on from the controls and the legal requirements, we're going to touch now on to processes and how you would create a process map, what information you'll feed into it, and ultimately the report that you're going to be able to create out the back of it. The easiest way that we see businesses manage their actual processes is to break them down into groups. So instead of just having company A and then every single process that belongs to it, we tend to see that they're broken down into function of the business, whether it's sales, whether it's support, maybe it's finance, HR. It's an easier way to break them down. The groups themselves can be given full descriptions, subtitles and titles, and then the processes can then be made a part of that as well. To create them, we simply select on creating at the top here. We can either assign a new process to an existing group, or we can create the new group from scratch at this point. If we go to select to yes, we want to assign a new process to our demo group and choose to select, you'll then be taken through again a very standardized format. So again, it's keeping that uniformed manner in which you actually tackle these tasks, so everyone is singing off the same song sheet, so to speak. At the top here, you'll have areas where you're going to be entering in its title. So we're just going to call this a test. We can then assign who the owner is that's going to be. So we're just going to say manager, and then the scope, purpose, and technical organizational measures are then required fields as well. If the wording is not too clear, we do have definitions of what information you typically would find in these areas. And then you can mark whether you're going to be acting as a controller, joint controller, processor, or a third party. Now, if you mark yourself as a controller of this process, you won't be asked to complete any further information, as that's something you would have completed earlier in the settings menus where you'd have entered in your DPO's data, etc. If, however, you're a processor of the data here, you'll then be asked to complete who the controller's contact details are and a representative for them as well. Once you've completed all of that, you then end up with a process created here. We've got all of those same drop-down menus, so we can see what controls we're using. And if we want to reference it quickly at this point, selecting information icons next to them, we can see their implementation status and the requirement for that. If you have the full suite or even Compliance Manager as a bolt-on, selecting open here takes you back to the control viewers, so you can see it in its entirety and what other areas might be related to that control as well. That works exactly the same for legal requirements, the GDPR, UK laws, DPIA 2018. If there's any related contracts, we can jump back to them. We can select information icons to get a bit more of a clear idea as to what we're looking at. Any tasks that have been assigned, related processes across the organization, are there any notes that have been left? And if we want to add a comment, we can do so and upload documents here, as well as a full audit history to see what modifications have been made to the overall input of the process itself. We can then have a full complete list of all of the assets that are currently being used in this process map. So once the map has been completed, this information will be made available, and selecting the information buttons on each one gives you that core information of the asset type, controller location, and description if there is one. As we've seen previously, you can jump back to the asset library by selecting open asset here as well. The last couple of sections will then show related records and any related risks that might come in tow with this particular process. Some other options that we have made available is the ability to clone a process. The purpose of this is you might find that multiple processes in the business are very similar with only one or two minor changes. Without reinventing the wheel every time, you can simply copy the entire process, including all of its scope, process owner, the assets inside it, etc. That can all be just cloned and then modifications made after the fact. What we're going to jump into now is actually the data flow map itself. So this is one that we've created previously. There are a lot of assets and a lot of transfers of data going on. Your process maps can be as simple as they need to be, or they can be as complex as they need to be. By that I mean some smaller businesses might just have a very simple sales process. There's only 3 or 4 assets involved during the entire process. Alternatively, when we look at some of our NHS users, they tend to have very complex process maps with a huge amount of data being sent through them as well. So it will scale to whatever you need it to do. What we are trying to illustrate in this process map here is a marketing process. So we're obtaining 3 small pieces of data, which are then taken, sent around multiple parts of our business, which are located in different areas. They're manipulated, they're used in certain manners, and then at the very end of it, we can see down here, it goes to our marketing CRM and desktop system, and then goes out onto a MailChimp, so it's kind of the marketing output from this process. The way that we build this process map is by using that asset library that we've been through previously. To get them onto the process map, it's just a matter of dragging and dropping them across. We can add new assets here, which not only add them to the process that we're looking at, but more specifically, they could then be linking directly into the asset library, so they can be used time and time again across other elements of the platform. We can add data inputs. We can also add data subjects at this stage as well. If we collapse this menu, we can then start working on the process map. Once you've got them all into place, we can use move tools to manipulate where they actually sit. So if we select on here, we can change the look and feel of the process. So if you need to free up a bit of space, you can do that without impeding any of the existing transfers you've already got. Creating the connections, we use this tool at the top here to select where we want to bridge the gap to. If we want to annotate the process at any point, we can do so by selecting the notes option. And if we want to select anywhere, we use the hand tool on the far left as well. So what we're going to look at this very early point is to show data subjects that are coming in. Is it coming from the subject or the broker? What the reference is, and then the data items themselves. We can illustrate data items moving individually, or we can show them as a process, as a record. And if we want to use the one that we created earlier, we can use the test one at this point as well, and it'll pre-populate that information for you. Once we hit save, we can see that the number of data items has been changed. We can see now how that information is being transferred, any comments, and is the data encrypted. Once we hit apply, the icon changes here, and then we can start showing that, okay, there were originally 3 data items. Selecting this transfer, we're now going to say, yes, that test data is also going to move through this point. It's going to go via a phone call, for example, and then we can just hit apply and it will start to show that change as it goes through. Once you've repeated that throughout the entire map, we can then start looking at how the individual assets are handling that information. So if we look at our information team here, we've got all that core information that we've seen on the asset library. Modifications made here will also update the asset library itself. We can also now go into storage. So whilst we know that these records are, have retention periods of 7 years, we might actually say that the known storage on this particular area is a little bit less. We could say that actually we only hold it on here for a 1-month period before it's destroyed, as it's no longer required. So if we cancel out of here and cancel, what we might also be able to see on here are highlighted lines in bold red. There's normally an exclamation point, and this is to highlight the fact that information is being transferred to a third country. So most of the assets on here are located either within the EEA or in the UK specifically, whereas our MailChimp system is actually based in the US. So it's just trying to ask us to define, it's a transfer to a third country. Do we have the appropriate safeguards in place, or derogations apply? If we now select standard data protection clauses and apply, we can now see that that's satisfied that requirement and it will clear the error for us. Once we've been through all of this, it's then just a matter of viewing the report, which can then be exported and then obviously submitted for auditing or whatever you need it for. At the top here, you've got that controller detail that would have been entered into settings. If we go through, you then have a process overview. So what information are we taking? How much? Does it go inside or outside the EEA? Is there cross-border processing? We then move on to a snapshot of what the actual overview of the process looks like. We then have a list of the personal data records themselves, including the items within them. We then have a list of the data subjects, a list of the assets, including all of that core information the asset contains. And then the very last tab on here is then going to be a tabular view of how we see the transfers themselves. So how is it happening? Where is it coming from? The data items, encryption levels, etc. Once we have finished on the process map, we'll just select save. It will then move us on into the DPIA if you have that module made available to you. So once this is finished saving and it's uploaded all its data back into the cloud to be stored, we can then go into the DPIA where there's a standard set of questions that you can go through to understand whether the assessment needs to be completed or not. So if we select on DPIA now, it will take us in to say, yes, the DPIA has been completed and the process has been authorized. Now, this is what a completed DPIA looks like. Yours will initially say that none of these are completed and you need to start going through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Depending on how you answer sections 1 and 2, the system will automatically say, look, the DPIA doesn't actually need to be done, or yes, based on what you've said, there is large amounts of data being processed by an automated system, then yes, you'll need to go through and conduct the rest of it. Each one of these, we'll just have a quick look into them, are standardized questions to help you satisfy the GDPR requirements, and it will take you through. So again, it's that uniformed answer. There's no worry of somebody entering in a random question that shouldn't be in there. So it's all going to be exactly the same each and every time you complete one. If we close out of here and we go through to our privacy risk assessment, selecting view and edit on here will take us into the assessment where we've identified what assets might be at risk at this point, including the data subjects. We can see what those threats and vulnerabilities are, the initial risk and residual risk to the business, and how you're choosing to treat them. We can add risks, we can edit the settings here. So if you want to modify what your initial risk and, what your impact and likelihood scales are going to be, that can all be done under here. And then we can say consultation with the supervisory authority has been required. And if no, then there's a filled box for you to complete at the bottom. Once you have completed all of that, it will then say, yes, the DPIA has been completed, and then you can run your report, which essentially summarizes all of the questions you've answered and essentially gives you that seal of approval at the very end. So now that we've covered off data flow mapping and DPIAs, what we're now going to be moving on into is risk assessments. So risk assessments can be used for privacy risk, they can be used for 27001, they can be used for multiple frameworks all at once. So if you're going to be using NIST and 27001, that can be utilized in a uniform fashion as well. What we're greeted with at the top here is again that create new button. So very similar to the data mapping tool, selecting create new here and dropping down, we can choose if we want to assign it to a particular assessment group, or we can create a brand new assessment from scratch at the bottom. Here we're going to create again just another test one, and we're going to now start filling in our scales. So our likelihood, this can all be modified, so it's all free text boxes, so you can choose exactly what you want it to be shown as, and we can also add additional context. So if you want to look at it in a percentage bar, you can also add that on as well. As we go through, you'll then move on into impact on the organization, so very low all the way to very high. Text can be customized, what the impact is going to be on the CI&A, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and these can be edited as well. So if you use your own wording, that can be changed as well. And you can also add more context at this stage. So if you want to add maybe financial impact or even reputational, there are additional factors you can put into here as well. You then move on into your criteria. So how much do you see, or how much are you willing to accept to be broadly acceptable, tolerable, intolerable? The wordings can be changed as well as the colors, and you can also add additional context. So if you have something for critical, for example, that could be added on for an additional criteria if you needed to. Once we've done measurements for the organization, you can then do it for privacy risk as well. So this is purely going to be for the rights and freedoms of data subjects. It can have its own impact scale entirely, so it doesn't need to mirror your organizational impact. And this is what the DPIA information will pull through as well. So once you've created a group, it's then going to be a matter of creating obviously the risk assessments that belong in them as well. If we look at our advisor mobile devices, obviously we've referenced this a few times now already, we can start to see a breakdown of the additional controls that the risk is going to be using, what tasks are related specifically to this risk, and if there's any other areas that it might relate to. So other risks across the business, are there legal requirements that need to be factored in, contracts, processes, or any notes or documents that need to be stored as well. To create them, I'm just going to show you this by editing an existing one. You'll be taken through, again, a very standardized format. So there's no cause for error in maybe a formula that's been created or a macro. Then a spreadsheet is a very cookie cutter way of looking at it each and every time. You'll be asked at this point to ascertain if it's an asset or a class that you want to do it by. You can also do scenario based as well if that's an easier method that you prefer to use. We have quick search functionality built into all of our elements. You can just use keywords. When we're looking at controls, you can use the actual annex references as well. Once we're happy with the asset we've chosen, you then come into the threat and vulnerability list. So this is that long list of around 150 different threats and vulnerabilities preloaded, but you can also add this, as we saw in the aforementioned settings menus as well. Once we go through, you can choose your vulnerability. and then it'll be moving on to the scoring of the risk based on your criteria and the assessment that you've created. Once you've done this for the organization, you can then do it for the initial risk to the data subject. So at the top left-hand corner, you should be able to see a toggleable switch. You don't always have to measure this if you're doing one for ISO, but it might be worth adding it on as an extra value add or an extra level of assessment if you wanted to. Once we're happy with all of this, we can then now set what our response is going to be. So you might find that you might simply be identifying risks, so with threat and vulnerability combinations, you simply cannot take on as a business, but you need to show that you've highlighted or understand that they do exist. So yes, we know that this is a risk that could apply to us. We're choosing to avoid it, therefore we're not actually going to put that into place. So you'll have modify, share, retain, and avoid. Each one has its description, and then you've got your justification as to why you've chosen to do that. Next, we then move into the controls. So again, here I mentioned that you can use keywords. You can also use the references that belong to them. So if we're looking at PCI DSS, or if we're looking at 27001, the keyword search will find anything within any of those frameworks that are already available to you. Once we're happy with that, it's now down to scoring after the fact. So what have the controls done to help bring the risk down, not only for the organization, but also to our data subjects? And then we get to the point of completion. So finalizing the risk by outlining who the owner of the risk is going to be, any comments or documents you wish to support it with. And again, you've got that same audit trail to show exactly what has changed, what's been modified, who made it and when. From here, there are two reports that you can pull. One is going to be specific to the risk that you're viewing at that point. So running the risk report, we have a list of the controls we're using, tasks that have been assigned to it, assets that it belongs to, does it belong to an asset class, and any other associated risks. So essentially it's just completing all of those drop-down tabs we've seen and bringing it into one easy to read report. The second report that you can run from here is going to be the risk treatment plan. So if we use the clipboard icon at the top of the assessment, running this, it will then give you the date that the risk treatment plan has been run, the organization and what the report is. And then we have the top level information for the asset, threat and vulnerability, responses, ownership, and then now we'll start to look at the controls themselves. More importantly, the tasks that have been assigned to them and the tasks that have been assigned to the actual risk, including deadlines, who owns it, and their status as well. So once we've been through risks themselves, what we're going to start looking at now are tasks and any other areas of the business that might need to be looked after, such as breach reporting, data subject access requests, organizational tasks, third party, and then we'll finish up on the gap analysis tool. The first tab on here is going to be breach reports. Now this can be whether you want to keep track of near misses, whether you want to keep track of anything that's definitely been reportable, or just something that you need to keep a note of at any point. So the top one here we're going to say is due to a loss of a laptop. The owner is myself. The date of awareness was back on the 14th of June, and we set the deadline to be the 14th of June. This can be customized, so obviously you can set it, but there will be a warning to say how long you typically have to actually decide on what you're going to do with the breach. As we go through, you'll have standardized sets of questions, again, also illustrating how you're complying with certain articles, and you'll have a little scoring over here on the right hand side to show you your status. So how far are you through the breach? And then at the bottom here, you can assign tasks to it. You can show what processes might be affected by this breach, what notes or comments you wish to add to it, and what risks you might be shown as a relationship. So here's that advisor mobile devices, that risk that we've just been through. And if we need to go back in, selecting the information button shows you the top level information and the ability to open the risk and maybe change what the scoring might be based on this breach that you've just identified. From here, you can run reports. You can filter down to all of the breaches that are planned, in progress, overdue or completed, and then you've also got the reporting functionality at the top here as well. The next section for tasks is going to be data subject access requests, and this is something I mentioned earlier with regards to keeping track of all of them, to either illustrate maybe a way that you could speed up how long a DSAR takes, maybe change who maybe owns them in the future, or more importantly, illustrating a reason as to why you may not need to do it, or why you might need to have an extension on a DSAR as well. So we're saying here that John Smith on the 11th of June asked for all of this information. It will then set the deadline for you, so within the calendar month, who owns it, its status, and the details as well. Again, you've then got the standardized list of questions you'll need to go through and satisfy certain areas of the GDPR. And once we get to the very bottom, you can hit save to say that yes, we've now sent out all of that information, and you can mark the DSAR as complete. You've got that same functionality at the top here. So if we select a particular DSAR at the top, you've then got the reporting functionality and the way to filter through all of them that have been completed if you've got an auditor, overdue, in progress, or planned as well. The next area for tasks is going to be organizational tasks. Now, mine will look a little bit messy because it's a demonstration portal. However, what this is going to give you a top level view is every single task, regardless of where it is stored inside the system. So this could be a task assigned to a process map. It could be assigned to a risk control, a regulation, an asset. Regardless of where it is, it will all be shown in here. If we pull these into view and pull them across, we can expand on each one to show when the tasks were created. We can see who the owners are and descriptions of what those tasks are going to be. But more importantly, we can then see where they relate to across our platform. So if we're looking at any one of these, we can say that this task is actually going to be associated to a certain set of assets. Maybe it's related to a certain number of contracts, and then we can mark the status over here on the right hand side, as well as run reporting functionality in here as well, as you've seen with every other element of the tool as well. The last section of the tasks is for third parties. So the housing association that we spoke to earlier, they like to keep track of maybe subcontractors they have for maintaining their buildings, maybe tenants to show that the tenancy agreement is going to be in place, and it's just a way of keeping track of all of that information. If we expand on here, we can see top level information to see the deadline. So when is that third party due for renewal, or maybe just a visit again to make sure that they are still complying with our data protection practices. We can see who owns them, if they're completed, and then just standardized questions. So have you requested information from the third party about their data protection practices? Yes, no, don't know, in part. And then you've also got some pre-built questionnaires that you can download. You can put them into a Word document. So if you need to modify them to suit your needs a little bit better as a business, you can do so. Send them out to the third party, assign a task to them, maybe chase it up in a few weeks' time. Once you get it back, you can then upload the file here and save it and have that task in place ready for, let's say, a 6-month or a 12-month visit, just to make sure that it is still up to date and correct. Lastly, what we'll move on into is then the gap analysis tools. This might be aimed more at maybe smaller businesses that, again, like I said, don't have the resource for consultants to come in and do this for them. Or alternatively, we've also seen some of our larger clients using our consultancy services in conjunction with this. So the consultant will do the work inside here, and then obviously the client has that information ready to hand whenever they need it, as well as the rest of their compliancy project within CyberComply. Dropping down each one of these, we can see each area that you'll need to go through. So if we now select on 4.1, context of the organization, we can see that we've answered this positively. If there are other pages you need to go through or details you need to give, that can also be listed in here as well. If we then just hit save, and it will take us back, it will then obviously mark that this is green and it's acceptable. There's no gap at this part of the business. Once you go through, you'll have a quick pie chart overview to say that yes, we've answered all 333 questions, only 271 of them are compliant though. Here you'll be able to see very quickly maybe your main area of focus where you need to put a bit more of your resource into to get it back up to scratch. So here we can see that support is the main area that we need to focus on, particularly in awareness, communication, creating and updating documentation, and control of the documented information as well. As you go through, obviously the compliant bar should come to a complete, but it is always still worth adding tasks in here to maybe revisit it at a later point to also make sure that the gaps are still as they should be, or ideally there shouldn't be any at all once you've put the remediation work in. So from here, we're going to return back to the dashboard and ultimately see our project in its visual representation. So we can see all of that top level information to the top risks, the data breaches that we have, overdue, completed, etc. Gap analysis progress, third-party due diligence, locations for processes, and again, that task menu as well. So from my perspective, that is as much as we're going to be going through today. I hope it has been helpful for everybody. If you do have any questions, there is a chat functionality, or you can select to raise your hand in the webinar options, and we'll answer any questions as we go through. But from myself here at Vigilant Software, I would like to thank you all for your time this morning. I do hope personally that it has been a help, and it either helps you on maybe taking on another part of CyberComply or helping you understand the part that you already have access to. So thank you very much for your time, and I welcome any questions. Yes, Sam, I've just seen your question come through. That's not a problem at all. So yes, if you do have any other questions regarding the data flow mapping tool, please feel free to contact us through the support channels or myself directly. I'll be more than happy to go through any other concerns you might have or anything else you'd like to touch on to clarify any points that I've been over on today's webinar. Okay, if there's no further questions from anybody, again, I'd like to thank you all for your time. The meeting will close shortly, but there will be a follow-up email sent out to everybody, including links to the recording of this session, as well as some just general collateral to follow afterwards. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you.